It's time to go beyond the headlines, cause I don't put in overtime just so I can headline. Okay, now it's Fox Sports, I'm live with Renee. Going hard every day, sports rapping every play. Different segments for your favorites, coming at you daily with positive vibes, yeah, we some game changers. Basketball, football, soccer, with different interviews, you never know who may pop up. Listen, only on Beyond the Headlines, this is Beyond the Headlines. Only on Beyond the Headlines, this is Beyond the Headlines. Only on Beyond the Headlines, this is Beyond the Headlines with Renee Washington.
Welcome back to Beyond the Headlines with Renee Washington. We have plenty of NFL talk to get into. So joining me this week, we've got Eagles beat writer for The Athletic, Zach Berman, on the show. Zach, welcome to the show.
I appreciate that. Glad to be on.
I just first, before we even get into the football conversation, I have to ask, what is your new normal? How is the coronavirus and COVID-19 affecting your work as an Eagles beat writer?
Sure. So if you think this time of year for a football writer, you're typically working from home. So that part hasn't changed. And the NFL's probably been the least affected in terms of coverage because it's the off season and they still continued with free agency. They're continuing with the draft. Now there are some logistical changes in the sense that I'm not going in for press conferences. Everything's kind of done over the phone. I would typically be at the owners' meetings today down in Florida, and those were canceled. So that changed. But in terms of what I'm covering, it's the same. It's the same events in the sense of free agency and the draft that I would in a different year. Now it's obviously affected everyone's lives, and in my case, I have a 2-year-old and a 1-year-old. My wife's working from home, so it's kind of an adjustment in terms of allocating time. But in terms of what I'm covering, that hasn't necessarily changed because of everything that's going on in the world right now.
That makes sense. Yeah. And I know there have been a lot of discussions around, how, because we don't know how long this is going to last, if it's going to affect, preseason and the season in itself, if this does happen to continue through the summer and into the fall. So fortunately for you, as you mentioned, it doesn't affect too much, but we do know that there has still been plenty of conversations going on. I think the NFL actually is one of the leagues that are keeping us sane right now because we have been able to have these conversations around free agency and it's giving us plenty of sports talk. So I feel like we haven't had a chance to talk about the combine enough. It finished up early March, and that was around the time that things were starting to shut down around the coronavirus. So it seems like we never really had a full chance to get into it, but you're fortunate to be able to go and cover it and watch all the tests and things that are going on for players. But do you have any players in particular that really stood out for you in the NFL Combine as we're looking to see who's going to step into the league and make an impact?
Yeah, so when I'm there, it's mainly for the interviews and for the relationship building with all the different people in the NFL who are there. And in terms of the players I was kind of keying in on, the Eagles have a great need a wide receiver. This is considered a historic wide receiver draft class. So I was really focused on the interviews and the performance of the players at that position. So obviously seeing what Henry Ruggs ran at the combine, that jumped out. Denzel Mims is someone whose athletic testing really kind of helped him chase Claypool. And then kind of the top receivers there, having a chance to talk to them, whether it was Jerry Jeudy or CeeDee Lamb. So in my case, when I was there, the players I was really focused on were the wide receivers. But most of my time there was spent in terms of interviews and really kind of focused on the team side of it.
Yeah. And we have been hearing about, around everything going on with the pandemic, the fact that teams are moving to holding their interviews, over video or over the phone versus in person. And it's going to be interesting to see how that affects this process, when you're not able to sit down face to face and have these conversations. As you talk about teams that have needs and are looking to fill positions and roles on the roster, and now you have to do it in a unique way. So I'm not really sure how that's going to play a factor into the effectiveness of being able to bring players in, but also,
Yeah, I think that's going to be a major change, and it's something all teams are going to have to figure out how to deal with. In that there aren't pro days this year, so or at most of these schools, some were able to get them in before, but because there aren't pro days, you're not getting the times and the physical testing of some of the players who did not perform at the combine, and there are not these top 30 visits. So typically you bring in 30 players to your facility, and those are really valuable for teams to either get to know a player better. And what you're also looking for is kind of standardized medical information, and you want your doctor to be able to see medicals on players who have those questions. And if those guys weren't at the combine, or they were dealing with something at the combine, that's something that lingers as well. So I'm fascinated to see how that affects the draft process. Certainly the pre-draft is different this year than any year that I've been covering the NFL, and so that's been since 2010. So I'm really curious to see how that works.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I know even a conversation I was having with a former guest that played in the NFL, Stacey Dillard, was talking about how the combine didn't go as well for him, but he was able to still get seen in those, meetings that he was having with teams, and in those abilities to be able to kind of show his skill again, whether it's just, talking to them or as you talk about having them do other testing and things like that. So it does limit players now, because if you didn't do well in the combine, and, of course there's always film you can look at from their college career, but it's not the same. You want to have as many opportunities to show your skill set as possible. So I have no idea how much this is going to affect players, and I feel bad for them, for the recruiting process on all levels, high school, college, getting into the pros, because you just do not have as many opportunities to be able to show your stuff,
Yeah, that's a good point. And I don't think, frankly, it's going to affect the top prospects as much.
Absolutely.
But if you're a smaller school player who was not invited to the combine, and the either the top 30 visits, or perhaps there was a pro day that you're performing at, those would have been real valuable opportunities that those players don't have. And then also there were a handful of players who did not test at the combine, either for medical reasons or for personal reasons, and they were hoping to kind of do so at their pro days. And not having the testing numbers on those players could potentially affect them, because what you're really looking for is an apples to apples comparison. You want to know, how does player X run compared to player Y? Excuse me. And when you don't have that, it certainly alters, or it affects the evaluation. Now, like you said, you have their body of work in college. Your scouts have been studying these players all year. So there is kind of this database of information. It's just different than the information you would typically have going into the draft. So I'm curious to see how teams manage that. I think you're going to see some really good drafts compared to some really bad drafts. And I suppose that happens every year, but I think there are mitigating circumstances this year that will really play a role.
Yeah. So as we're talking about this, and we're getting into how players are going to, be affected through this process, I want to get into also what we've been seeing around free agency and around, all the roster moves so far, because as mentioned, there has been no shortage of excitement and confusion, questions, however you react to it, that's been going on. I'm going to start with the Eagles, of course, because
Sure.
I'm an Eagles fan. You're an Eagles beat writer, so I feel like it only makes sense. But I know last season, as we watched the injury-plagued Eagles, of course, yes, we still won the NFC East, but the Eagles were not able to really compete at a high level because of, the injuries, not having depth in the wide receiver role. When you look at the players that were on the field, and speaking on receivers to start with, there were no receivers to throw to. Carson Wentz didn't have the receivers. Then you look on the other side when you have the quarterbacks. I know so far we've seen Malcolm Jenkins signed with the Saints. We saw Ronald Darby just get a contract with the Redskins. Nelson Aguilar is going to the Raiders. There have been some moves that have been made on both sides of the ball to bring in new blood. And I know that's something that I was looking at that needed to happen. Some youth, some younger guys, some healthier guys. For the Eagles, as we talk about the wide receiver needs, what have you been seeing that really makes sense for the Eagles moving forward to be able to now get over that injury plague that we've seen the last couple seasons and be a team that not only wins the NFC East, but has a stronger potential of being a playoff, making it farther in the playoffs, making it farther in the postseason?
Sure. So like you said, the Eagles really didn't address wide receiver this offseason, which I think came as a surprise to a lot of people. That being said, I think they're really looking at the draft as their avenue to do so. That they think this is a deep wide receiver class. Obviously, a lot of people think that it is a deep wide receiver class. You need to pick the right ones, and you don't know how the board's going to shake. But I think the Eagles really want to build that position organically. And they want these young players growing with Carson Wentz. So that's a big component. And if we have this conversation in May, I think that depth chart's going to look different than it does now. I spoke to General Manager Howie Roseman last week, and he's insisting that they don't think the cupboard is bare on their own roster, and they like their receivers more than the general public does. Some of that might be lip service, to be frank with you. I need to think that they are concerned about the position. They have Deshaun Jackson under contract. He only finished one game last season. Now, he's obviously one of the best players or best receivers in Eagles history, but he's getting older. He's injury prone. Relying on him is a risk. Now, it could be a great reward, but like you saw last year, if you're not adequately prepared for a Deshaun Jackson injury, it's really going to affect your team. Alshon Jeffrey's still under contract, and there's been a lot of speculation whether the Eagles will keep him. The reality with Alshon Jeffrey is he's recovering from a Liz Frank injury, a major injury, and the Eagles signed him to a contract extension before last season. It was really an ill-conceived contract extension that's financially burdensome for the team if they were to try to move on from him. Everything Howie Roseman's saying is kind of suggesting that they're expecting Alshon Jeffrey to be with the team. We'll see what happens here. Now, Alshon has been really productive for the Eagles, but he is getting older and he is coming off that injury. So that's a major question as well. J.J. Arcega-Whiteside last year, their second-round pick, underachieved in his rookie season. And then you have guys like Greg Ward who played well late in the year, but are you counting on him as an every down type player? There is some risk there. So I think the Eagles are really going to address the position in the draft, and I wouldn't be surprised if they make an addition, whether it's via trade or kind of an inexpensive flyer signing, just to have some certainty there. But it is it's a major question mark at this point, and the Eagles, if you look at their roster, it's really the biggest hole as we look at it today.
Yeah, and I think the biggest thing as you talk about is, do you take that risk of relying on players like an older Deshaun Jackson, like an Alshon Jeffrey coming off an injury, when we know in the past that's been a downfall for the Eagles? Not having that receiver depth has put so much pressure on Carson Wentz, and I'm not saying his concussion and the way that his season ended had anything to do with that, but it was a hindrance to his ability because he literally had no one to throw the ball to, putting it point blank. There were guys that, we were excited about coming into the season that now as we get into the bulk of the season where we need them, looking at Deshaun Jackson, he's not out there, and I think that's something that, as you talk about, has to be an area that the Eagles are focusing on because, you're going to just have, unfortunately, the same exact type of season if there's no depth, if there's no youth, if there's not a change, especially with the receivers. And of course, there are other pieces that need to happen around the ball, but the receivers have to be the priority, without a doubt.
Yeah, and you're really trusting your scouting, which frankly hasn't always worked
Right.
at wide receiver. So it's one thing to say this is a historic wide receiver draft class, or this is a deep wide receiver draft class, and that very well might be the case. But for instance, in 2017, it was a very deep running back draft class. The Eagles needed a running back. The board did not fall as they thought. They ended up with Donnell Pumphrey. It didn't work out. There have been deep cornerback classes that it just didn't work out the way the Eagles thought. Last year was a deep defensive line draft class. The board didn't fall the way the Eagles expected. They took Sharif Miller in the 4th round, and in his rookie season, he was not a contributor. So it's risky going into the draft saying we're going to address this position with draft picks because, A, you don't know how the board's going to fall, and you could take the wrong player. So I think the Eagles are gambling, and we'll see in May, and frankly, we'll see in September, October, November, December, how that gamble pays off.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still very bitter over the fact that players like DK Metcalf are not in an Eagles jersey right now. So that's the thing. When you look at the draft, you are really taking a gamble because you don't know how these players, especially this year, given all the changes and adjustments around the draft and around how scouts are able to communicate with players and analyze players, you really are taking a gamble versus a player that you have seen in the league that you maybe try to pick up in free agency or in some, in a trade or something that you've already seen established in how they made that adjustment into the league and how they can play in the NFL. So I'm just hopeful that it's going to work out because I don't know if I can take another season of injuries and everybody blaming Carson Wentz when he has no receivers around him.
Sure.
It's time for a change. But we have also seen a lot of other changes around the league. There are just a few that I would love to highlight and get your thoughts on. Got to start down in Tampa Bay with Tom Brady deciding to leave New England. We saw how that all unfolded. First speculation that he was going to leave, of course, with the way the Patriots season ended last year. Speculation that he was going to retire versus moving to a different team. Of course, we've heard TB12 is going to TB as everyone keeps trademarking and hashtagging and everything. Your thoughts on Tom Brady, whether or not this is the right move for him to join Tampa Bay, a team that he has more success individually than the entire franchise
Sure.
and the history of that program as a whole. And I mean, I was all for, I get he wants to play until he's 45, and we've heard the rumors of how long he's trying to stay in the league, but I was all for him either retiring or finishing up his career in New England. Like we've seen players like Michael Jordan have in the NBA when he came out of retirement and played with the Wizards. Do you think this is going to be a good move for Tom Brady, or essentially, I won't say tarnish his legacy, nothing can tarnish that, but take away from the success that he's had?
That's a good question. I mean, football-wise, it's certainly a sensible move. I mean, they have talented wide receivers, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin. They have talented tight ends. They have a quarterback-friendly head coach. So there's a lot of pieces there to work with offensively. Now, their offensive line, especially on the right side, probably can be better. But I mean, we'll kind of see how that shakes out. But no, excuse me. I mean, he's a career New England Patriot. He's perhaps the best player in NFL history. So when a guy like that changes teams, it is a shock to the system, and especially when he goes to a team that's not necessarily like a storied franchise or a major market. That being said, I certainly see it from the football perspective, from the football fit, and Tom Brady earned the right to kind of choose the way he goes out. I'm fascinated to see. I think it certainly affects the NFC, and the NFC South is deep as it is. This certainly affects it too. So I mean, my thoughts on it were from a football perspective. There's there's a lot of reasons to be intrigued just because of the weapons he has there relative to the weapons he had in New England.
Yeah, I think it's, you hit on a couple key points. Tom now being a part of, the NFC South, and now you're playing Drew Brees and the Saints. You're playing, it's a different look for him that's going to be fun to watch in itself, because switching from the AFC to the NFC and now playing different teams more in the season in itself is one thing that's going to be a change that could negatively affect him. You look at the way that Drew Brees has been able to, and the Saints have been able to defeat Tom Brady in the past, and Drew Brees has won out that quarterback battle, so to speak. But also, as you talk about, it could be a good move in the sense that, he's got pieces around him that could lend to be this to make sense. As we talk about, the Patriots also having a lot of needs in the past season, and a lot of areas of weakness, as they were not nearly as dominant and strong as we've seen in the past. But I'm not sure about this one. It's definitely going to be something that I think we're going to have to watch how it unfolds to see if it makes sense.
Yeah, I agree with you there.
Yeah. So I'm just curious, my last thoughts on some other changes that have happened as a result. As we have Tom Brady moving to Tampa Bay, I was curious, as this decision was even coming about, okay, what does that mean for Jameis Winston? As Teddy Bridgewater moves to the Panthers, what does this mean for Cam Newton? Even with Derek Carr in Las Vegas with the Raiders, and how Marcus Mariota joining them affects him. But also, there are a lot of free agents that are still on the table, Clowney being one of them. So I'm curious to know, I'm looking specifically at Cam Newton, Jameis Winston. Do you think there's a spot a team that makes sense for them, where they're going to be able to come in and be the top quarterback, get the contract that they want, play at the level that they want? I mean, I don't see all these things aligning, honestly, and I'm wondering if their time is up in a sense.
Well, I wouldn't say the time's up, but certainly, kind of being the unquestioned franchise quarterback, I think that I don't think they're going to find that opportunity now, and I don't think they're going to find that big contract either. Now, there are teams that, could have quarterback competitions or unstable quarterback situations. But I can't tell you that they'll be interested in either Cam Newton or Jameis Winston. But like, for instance, New England has a hole at quarterback. The Chargers, it seems like they're going with Tyrod Taylor. They're obviously a candidate to draft a quarterback too. But that's always a situation to watch. Jacksonville seems like they're going with Gardner Minshew, but that's a situation to watch.
Right.
So there, and then there are teams with older quarterbacks, whether it's Pittsburgh, for instance. That's a team to watch. But I don't think there's kind of that one pristine opportunity, and there's also competition for those spots. Whether you're talking about quarterbacks in the draft this year, Andy Dalton is a candidate to be traded. So it's one of those things where there's more supply than there is demand right now, and someone's going to kind of be left out of the musical chairs.
Oh, I like that. I like that. I do think that's a great point. There's more supply than there is demand, because this isn't, for a lot of coaches, they kind of have their pick of the quarterbacks between the draft and the players that are available. So it's not like you have to go and scramble and pick up Cam or pick up Jameis Winston.
Sure.
There are plenty of options, and if you think that a certain player is going to be a fit, whether it's for financial reasons, personality reasons, whatever, you have your pick of different types of quarterbacks that you can bring in. So I'm a Cam Newton fan. I enjoy his game. Jameis Winston, I'm hit or miss on, so don't really. Not say I don't care, but I care more about Cam the fact that Cam Newton's future is up in the air, and that's something that was shocking to me, but not shocking when you look at injuries, as we've been talking about.
In Cam Newton's case, I think really injuries are.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the question. In Jameis Winston's case, turnovers are the question.
Mm-hmm.
But both play. I mean, it's a different conversation. Cam's a former MVP. He's led a team to a Super Bowl.
Exactly.
So he's done it. Jameis Winston has been productive in the league, but I with him, he's obviously younger. I think there's kind of potential for a career renaissance, but I don't think he'll find that spot where he's the franchise quarterback. You saw Marcus Mariota, for instance, who was drafted the same year as him, goes to Las Vegas and is essentially competing with Derek Carr. He'll be the backup, but essentially competing there. And so Jameis might have to look for that kind of situation.
Exactly. And we've definitely seen, as you talk about with Marcus Mariota, quarterbacks losing their spot, and now you're competing as the backup. And that's something that could definitely be the future for Jameis Winston. Cam Newton is just, as you talk about his past success, it's just a shame to see how injuries affect players. But that's something that, as we talk about with the Eagles and these different topics we're getting into, you never know how players, you could be a former MVP and an injury sets you back to now being a player that's looking for a team. So a lot going on right now, and it'll be interesting to see as we get into April how this is all going to shake out as we continue to move forward in preparing for the draft. But Zach, thank you so much for joining the show. And I'd love for you to just share where our listeners can follow you before we wrap this up.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you having me on. I enjoyed it. If you go to The Athletic, theathletic.com, if you go to twitter.com/zberm, ZBERM, you can find my stories there. And we have a promotion now. If you're not a subscriber, you can get 90 days free. And so it's a great opportunity, not just to read our Eagles coverage, but our coverage across the board, all the NFL teams, all the Major League Baseball, NBA, NHL. There's college basketball, college football on there. There's Premier League soccer. So there's it's a place to find all your coverage. So I would check out my stuff at theathletic.com or twitter.com/zberm.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Zach, for joining us on the show. I hope you stay safe and stay healthy, of course, first and foremost, during this incredibly terrible time around the coronavirus. But also, I'm looking forward to continuing to see your sports coverage as we move forward into the next part of the spring season. So thank you for joining Beyond the Headlines with Renee Washington.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.